The Tudor period, beginning in 1485 with Henry VII's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the War of the Roses, and the Tudor period ends in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth I. The context of this time period is that the Tudors inherited a well-founded law system. Monarchs were hugely powerful, and a strong unified law system had been established with official government posts. However, the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII, came to power following a 30-year civil war called the War of the Roses, called this because of the family emblems of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. This meant that as the Tudors had taken power by force, they were terrified it could be lost and taken away from them the same way. This led to huge amounts of paranoia from authorities, believing that they saw treason everywhere. This meant crime was punished brutally, for example, the hanging, drawing and quartering of those accused of treason. There are some key beliefs which shape the methods of crime and punishment during this time period. For example, you have divine right, which continues from earlier on in the course. The belief that the monarch was chosen by God, therefore treason was linked to heresy. An offence against the king was an offence against God, a belief particularly prominent following the English Reformation in 1533. Protestant, in which Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and established his own Church of England. Protestant monarchs were also the head of the Church, and therefore treason and heresy were intertwined. Another key belief of this period was the hierarchy. Society was ordered in terms of power. This is linked to wealth, gender and age. The feudal system had broken down, but there was still a strict hierarchy. Crimes which challenged this hierarchy were punished harshly. Vagrancy was a threat to the hierarchy, as local lords could not control the local population that travelled around. The haves fear the have-nots, as in people with property fear those who do not have it, because they fear it will be taken away from them by the poor. The rich want to stay on top, so they became worried that people would survive by taking, ultimately leading to begging being criminalised, which we'll discuss later on. The other key belief was property. Before mass production, people's property was hugely valued. Only people with property could make laws, so they used the law to protect themselves, as shown by the fact that theft of anything over 12p was a felony and therefore punishable by death. So what we'll see during this time period is authorities trying to establish law and order and control the population, but still not dealing with the root causes of crime. They revert to the familiar old tactics of brutal public punishment in order to deter crime. The number of executions increase. As I've discussed earlier, Tudors took power by force, so on the lookout for enemies everywhere. They expect their old enemies to resurface. Therefore, publicly brutal punishments for treason. For example, the use of hanging, drawing and quartering. Criminals were dragged through a crowd, then hanged until almost dead, then cut into 4 pieces, which were then sent around the kingdom to deter acts of rebellion, a clear message of fear-mongering, and to deter acts of rebellion and instill fear amongst the population. We can also see the value of the hierarchy and how important a belief this was in the use of different punishments for the same crime. For example, commoners who committed treason were hanged, drawn and quartered. For example, the gunpowder plotters, who had been motivated by religious persecution against Catholics, they attempted to kill King James I in 1605. The brutality of their punishment was designed to reflect the seriousness of the crime. You also get nobles were beheaded, as they had divine right to rule. They were more important than commoners, so they had a quicker death for the same crime. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed by beheading in 1587, and later it was Charles I in 1649. They faced a less humiliating execution due to their higher social status and the fact they were chosen by God. This shows the importance of the hierarchy. Just quickly on that, whilst the gunpowder plot is 1605 and therefore after the Tudors, and the death of Charles I is 1649 and therefore after the Tudors, that's the Stuart period. However, a lot of the key beliefs and policies are the same during both time periods. They are a lingering hangover from the Tudor period, so effectively it's the same. During this time period, you also get begging criminalised, leading to a moral panic, hysteria about it. But what had caused begging? Well, you had large numbers of beggars travelling on the roads. This is a threat to society where people were expected to know their place within their local community. Up until now, people have basically been tied to the land their whole lives. The fact that people are forced, for a number of reasons which we'll get into in a second, to leave that land means they are much harder to control and enforce law and order. The other problem is that the acts of charity do not seem enough to meet the rising demand from the poor people. Societies cannot afford to give money to the poor. This then turns to resentment towards beggars because the cost of supporting beggars was resented by the communities they ended up in. So therefore, we're going to stop giving them money. What are beggars going to do when they can no longer raise money through begging? Well, the poor people were more likely to turn to other crimes such as theft, as they need it in order to survive. So, what caused the increase in beggars? Problems in the cloth industry increased the number of unemployed people. Inflation caused prices to go up faster than wages. People simply couldn't afford enough to pay for their goods. Henry VIII also closed the monasteries in 1533. This therefore took away support for the poor, as previously they could go to monasteries to be supported and be given soup and bread and things like that. Henry VIII closed the monasteries, sold off all the land, and this meant there was no support system for the poor. In addition to that, there was also a population increase, which put pressure on jobs and food. Landowners kept sheep instead of growing crops, and that needs fewer workers, means more people are unemployed, need to travel in order to find work. There's no national welfare system. Authorities, governments, kings do not have a system in place to help you if you lose your job or become too sick to work. In addition to that, you've got the end of the wars in England, which leads to soldiers being out of work. People previously employed as soldiers now have no job and therefore no money. How did the government respond to this, or how did authorities respond to this? Well, in 1531, Parliament passes a law which states that all beggars must be classed as either deserving, and they are given a licence or a badge, and the alternative for this was punishments. Justices of the peace are the ones responsible for enforcing this law. The deserving poor law was to prevent sturdy beggars. Sturdy beggars were sent to houses of correction. Sturdy beggars were people who were pretending they couldn't work in order to try and get money from other people in society. You also get 1547, the Vagrancy Act. This forced beggars to work and also ordered that any be whipped and branded, so that wherever they go, they are known as a beggar. This proved impossible to enforce as there were simply too many beggars, so the policy dropped later. However, the fact that this law was introduced shows how worried wealthy people in Parliament were about begging. Another continuation from previously is the fact that there is still no police force. Policing is still community-based, meaning it wasn't professional or controlled properly. Swelling towns led to less control. Community policing still works due to the fact there's no explosion in towns. Parish constables struggle with demand due to vagabonds moving from town to town, so we are still reliant on those local community justice systems. However, they are becoming much more difficult due to the steady growth of towns, but no explosion yet.